Younes is an engineer and a forest hydrologist. He's a professor at UBC. He is looking at the scientific evidence that experts and decision makers are using to build more sustainable models for managing forestry. His findings are long overdue for many of us in the Ango community. We applaud his scientific rigor, his focus, and his courage, actually, to challenge conventional forest management wisdom. Please welcome Younes Alila.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, IWTF, for having me with you today. The work that I'm going to be presenting is not a fun story to actually tell. It's actually a traumatizing story because 30 years of research work, being a prof in the Faculty of Forestry at UBC Vancouver campus, have revealed to me, after years of research publications and top peer-reviewed journals, that most of the landscapes in British Columbia and most of our watersheds are sitting at a very heightened risk when it comes to hydrology and geomorphology. And that in itself is, of course, a trauma to me, because that sort of science that I've been piling up and building and publishing goes against mainstream thinking in forest hydrology. It definitely goes against the mainstream forest hydrology that have guided or misguided the forestry practices in British Columbia for decades and counting. And I would like to start by doing the claimer that every previous presenter have been saying, that they're not an expert in anything. Well, I can tell you, I'm not an expert in forestry, but I can tell you a few things about hydrology. And those few things that I have learned, I've accumulated since I joined the Faculty of Forestry as an assistant prof in 1996. And unlike many of you who were raised out in the wilderness, in the forest, hiking and skiing, etc., I have been raised all the way until my last year in high school in the fields of palm trees and fig trees and pistachio trees and almond trees in southern Tunisia of North Africa. And I immigrated to Canada, and thanks for the host, as a student to do civil engineering at the University of Ottawa. And I have done 10 years of civil engineering, bachelor, master, and PhD at the University of Ottawa. Therefore, when I joined 1996, the Faculty of Forestry, I knew nothing about forest hydrology. Nothing, let alone forestry. And I remember the head of my department, Dr. Baskerville, God bless his soul, went to the department, colleagues of mine, and he told them, we've got someone with the right skills, but he has no forestry background. We're going to throw him out in the wood and see what he can do. And here, that is my story. And it explains a lot, the journey that I had since 1996. It's a heck of a journey. I don't regret it, but it's a traumatizing journey. And you will know when I get to the end of this. Our landscapes and all of our watersheds, with rarely any exception, are sitting at a very heightened risk to hydrology and geomorphology, much heightened than we were led to believe by government, industry, and professionals. You couldn't possibly blame the professionals, because professionals are actually applying what they see in the literature of forest hydrology. But that literature of forest hydrology, in my opinion, is misguided, and in the process has underestimated the effect of disturbing the forest by any means is affecting the hydrology. And I'm going to give you some examples of drainages or watersheds in British Columbia that have been the subject of flooding and frequent flooding in recent years out in the news. And the first example is that of the Kettle River Basin, which drains to the downtown of Grand Fork. Some of you may have heard in the news about the May 2018 flood event that have caused damage to 400 homes and many businesses in the downtown areas. And it actually triggered a class action lawsuit against a long list of forest industry, and the BC government. And when you've got flooding problems in the lowland, right, downstreams, in the Grand Fork areas, take a look at what is happening in the upland, upstreams, in the headwater. And I've shared with you a map in here that shows the extent of clear-cut logging for decades in the Kettle River Basin, a 10,000 square kilometer watershed, 8,000 of which are above the 49th parallel. And you could see in there are half a dozen at least logging companies operating simultaneously. And in my opinion, most of the logging prior to the 2018 flood event has been done without any coordination or without any resource or thinking about the cumulative effects of the different logging conducted by the various companies in the same drainage. I know in 2016, I think the BC government imposed or legislated cumulative effect studies, but that cumulative effect studies is still being conducted in-house by the BC government and is still not using the right framework when it comes to hydrology, at least. The second example is that of Cache Creek. Cache Creek have been in the news repeatedly when it comes to flooding. And when that happens, the first thing you need to find out, what's happening upstream, because that runoff is actually that it ended up going through downtown Cache Creek, end up generated at the source area in the headwaters. And sure, you could see the maps. On the right-hand side, a map of the historic clear-cut logging in the Bonaparte, and it's a huge. On the left-hand side, in more recent years, unfortunately, that same watershed, the Bonaparte, have been subject to severe wildfire. And when this is the case, you need to think of these watersheds as have a certain level, a certain capacity of actually assimilating abuse and disturbances. But once the level of abuse and disturbances exceed a certain threshold, hell break loose from there on. And this is why you see every other year is a flood. The flood that used to be experienced on average once every 100 years, now suddenly is experienced once every 10 years. And the one that used to be experienced on average once every 20 years is now experienced once every 5 years. So these larger floods are becoming more frequent. And you need to ask yourself why. Because the watershed have reached its capacity of resilience as a result of the cumulative effect over time and the cumulative effects over the landscape. Because there are two aspects to the cumulative effect. Then comes in the horrific story of the Cariboo region that have lost most of its forest cover most extensively over the last 20, 30 years, and most extensively since the salvage logging of the beetle infestation started in the late 90s. And as you could see in there, there have been repeatedly documented regional problems of landslides across the entire Cariboo regions. The railways have been moving. The roads that we travel on has been actually sinking and has been subject to landslides. The new residential areas that have been built in the 90s in the downtown of Quesnel and downtown of Williams Lake have been actually sliding on average 5 to 10 centimeters every year since the late 90s. And therefore, there was an article written by the Canadian Press, Brenna Owen, for which a bunch of us have been interviewed. And we pointed out the finger on the loss of the forest cover, causing basically the regional problem of the landslides. Then the third example is in your neck of the wood, the Okanagan Lake 2018, a flume of muddy flows coming from the outlet of the Peachland watershed as it discharges into the lake. And then that's the lowland. That's the downstream effect. Take a look of what's causing it. It can only be in the upland, in the headwater, the changes in the land use and the land cover in particular. And the map on the left shows the extent of clear-cut logging and historic clear-cut logging and extensive clear-cut logging in this community watershed. The next is Merritt, of course. And Merritt, the November 2021 flood event, has been flooded during this event, and they're still recovering from that flood event. And that is, again, another illustration of potential linkages between the loss of the forest cover, both in the Nicola as well as in the cold water watersheds, both of which have lost 30 to 40% of its forest cover, most of which is over the last couple of decades. And just in the season before the 2021 flood event in the summer, a quarter of the cold water watershed end up being severely affected by wildfire. And therefore, you could see how the risk in the lowland with regard to flooding is actually caused in the upland, in the headwater. Now, this is the last case that I wanted to share with you, the Chipeniuk watershed, 355 square kilometer in the Vancouver Island. There is repeated flooding in the lowland, and that have triggered a class action lawsuit against a long list of defenders. The federal government is on the top of that list. The provincial government is the second. Regional government is the third, and a bunch of other logging companies. And as you could see in there, most of the forest cover in this watershed has been lost. Historic clear cutting, and some of the historic clear cutting are still in regenerative mode. But as you know, if the logging is excessive and the forest cover and the regen is slow, automatically we're going to be subject to decades of heightened risk in terms of flooding and droughts and landslides. Now, this is yet another slide showing the same thing, but at a different scale. This map on the left is the Fraser River Basin with the historic logging that has been happening in there, most of which is mid to high elevation. These are the elevation that have actually caused most in terms of increase in the runoff and increase in the sediments, etc. So how did we get here? Why is it that our landscape are sitting at this extremely heightened risk to hydrology and geomorphology? Because these two are actually linked. Okay, so the allowable annual cut is one issue, right? We've been cutting way too much. And the unduly clause also had a lot to do with where we are right now. Although the BC government has made a move to actually abolish the unduly clause in the current act, which is a first move in the right direction, but there is much more that needs to be done. But the second problem that I have with regard to forestry is that, in my opinion, it has been and continued to be misguided in terms of forest hydrology. The forest hydrology that have been used to guide forest management in this province for decades is actually not scientifically sound. Why? Number one reason, it is mostly stand-level hydrology. It is the stand-level hydrology, the hydrology of a singular tree and the hydrology of a bunch of trees sitting next to each other that have guided forestry in this province, as manifested in concepts such as the equivalent cut area and the so-called hydrologic recovery curves that are used to calculate the ECA. And these hydrologic recovery curves are stand-level hydrologic recovery curve, and the stand-level hydrologic recovery curve is telling a story about how the snow accumulation and the snow melt recover over time after logging as a result of the regen. But that recovery of the above surface snow accumulation and melt at the stand level is no surrogate for the recovery of the runoff in the channel, for the recovery of the flood magnitude in the channel, for the recovery of the frequency of floods in the channel, right? So therefore, the ECA as a concept has a lot to do with what I refer to as us being misguided for decades and counting. And ECA has been used to further justify the forestry practices in the form of clear cutting. And as you will see, and as we move forward, you will see that the causal power of forest on hydrology increases with the scale, right? So you can only appreciate the power of the forest in mitigating hydrology and geomorphology and protecting us against flood risk, drought risk, and landslide risk. You can only appreciate that over the larger scale when you move from the tree to the stand to the hill slope to the watershed scale. And therefore, that tells you as we move forward that the effect of the forest on hydrology is an emergent effect. It's not a fundamental effect. Namely, it is an effect caused by the landscape features and the climate features, and it's not an effect necessarily caused by what happened at the stand. And it is that stand level hydrology that continue to misguide forestry in British Columbia. The second reason, the second problem with the status quo of forest hydrology that have guided and continue to do so for forestry in this province is that ECA as a concept that is not revealing how forest disturbance in any form affect the frequency of extremes, which means affects the hydrogeomorphic risk, because frequency means risk, right? Now, in 2009, we published our first paper on this topic in Water Resources Research entitled Forest and Floods, a New Paradigm Sheds Light on Age-Old Controversies. We, in this paper, called the community, the international science community, to abandon the old deterministic framework and adopt a new probabilistic framework designed to evaluate the effect of disturbances on extremes. And when I say extremes, it's landslides, droughts, and floods. And of course, extremes are associated not just with severity, how severe the extreme is, but how frequent it is. These two dimensions are critically important. And the two dimensions, especially the frequency dimension, can only be evaluated through that probabilistic framework. And that probabilistic framework have evaded forest hydrology scientists for over a century and counting. Worldwide, this is nothing special about British Columbia, right? Now, in this paper, we actually analyzed peak flows from 3 long-term per watershed study sites using both the old and the new frameworks, the deterministic and the probabilistic, and they both led to diametrically opposite outcomes. Namely, harvesting affects not only small and medium peak flows, but also the larger events. And the larger the peak flow event, the larger are the effect of forest disturbance. That's where the drama lies. Now, we actually called on the community to reevaluate past studies and the century-old paradigm that has shaped the science perception of forest extremes and the biophysical environment. You affect the variability of the hydrologic response, you affect the extremes of the hydrologic response, you affect the entire biophysical environment. You affect water quality, you affect destabilization of the channel, you affect aquatic life in the stream, you affect downstream community through flooding and calamities like that. Now, one thing to point out, that the probabilistic framework that we've been calling for single-handedly out of a single lab out of UBC and quietly for about 20 years is actually not a new science. Isn't that ironic? Isn't that funny? Why? Because the same framework is very well established outside forest hydrology. Hell, it's very well established even in the wider hydrology community. It's very well established, especially in climatology and climate change science. It's the way they evaluate the effect of global warming on weather extremes. So why would we evaluate the effect of land use and land cover changes on extremes in any different ways? Well, that's the nature of the wider hydrology community, split into subdivisions or divisions, and the forest hydrology is a division, and no one else from outside the forest hydrology know exactly how forest hydrologists in the science community have been evaluating their science, have been investigating the relationship between the forest cover and the hydrologic response, right? I have been receiving a lot of criticism from the wider public saying, we don't understand what this deterministic versus probabilistic framework. Can you not dumb it up so that people can actually understand it? And my response to that, my target is really the professionals, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the scientists who are silent, right? That's my target. It's not the wider public. But early this morning, when I wake up to actually prepare for this thing, I am registered in the newsletter of the National Observer. And this article today came in my inbox. Read that first line, right? It says, as the climate change increases the probability of extreme weather events, house insurance will become ever more important and expensive. Floods and fires are house wreckers, and high building costs mean high costs to insurance company when disasters hits. The only way you can demonstrate that global warming is affecting extreme weather is to demonstrate that global warming is increasing the probability of occurrence of these extremes, right? Why would the probabilistic framework need it? Would you be able to tell me when the next flood is going to hit? Of course not. Would you be able to tell me how severe it's going to be? Of course not. Would you be able to tell me the spatial extent of that flood event? Of course not. The same applies to wildfire and to droughts and to landslides. Why? Because their occurrence is subject to laws of chance. Sure, these laws of chance could be intensified by global warming, could be intensified by land use change, climate change, but they're laws of chance. And if their laws, if their occurrence is governed by laws of chance, you cannot use any framework other than the probabilistic framework, because probability is about chance, law of chance, probabilistic, right? Why do we call it flood risk, landslide risk? Because it's actually associated with the dimension of chanciness, right? This is the Russian roulette slide, which I think is the climax of my entire presentation. And therefore, I prepared my script for it. I want to make sure I get the message right. Why the probabilistic framework for understanding and predicting the effects of forest on extremes is a must. And if you don't do that, I'm sorry. Whatever you are using to guide management is scientifically indefensible, period. The answer to that why a probabilistic framework is needed, because the causes of floods, at times referred to as drivers of the floods, are multiple. It's not just one factor, multiple. For instance, floods in the snow environment are driven by, number one, every year, the amount of snow on the ground, the energy melting the snow, the state of watershed wetness prior to the event, potential rain falling on the melting snow. Guess what? These climate factors are not only multiple, but also chancy. Chancy means they are randomly occurring over time. We cannot investigate the effect of forest disturbance of any kind by just fixing only one of these factors, such as the storm or the snow or the energy causing the melt. And this is what has been done for over a century and counting. And there is still pushback, even from the international science community, but we prevail. At the end, we prevail. We've been pushing our publication, and every publication is not published without a big fight. It is critical to note that these hydroclimate drivers, and this is very important, these hydroclimate drivers are necessary but not sufficient to cause a flood of a certain severity. Why? This is a very important point. It is critical to note that snow on the ground and energy causing the melt, and rain falling on a snow melt, and soil moisture during, right, are necessary, but not sufficient to cause a flood. And the reason, we're not flooded every year, right? Although we have snow, we're not flooded every year. Therefore, having these hydroclimate factors are necessary, but not sufficient. And that's critical. Why? Because in comes the role of landscape features in either amplifying or reducing flood potentials or risk. Michel, didn't I tell you the flood response is an emergent response? It's not a fundamental response, which means the flood response is dictated by the landscape features and the climate features over time combined. The flood response is not fundamental. You cannot reason around the floods using ECA. You cannot, and therefore you cannot reason about the effect of forest on hydrology and geomorphology without considering, by just looking at the stand level process in terms of snow accumulation, in terms of snow melt, in terms of water balance at the tree level or at the stand level. So these landscape features, chief of them is the elevation distribution within a watershed, meaning mountainous versus gentle or even plateau-like topography. Give you examples. Gentle or subdued terrains are more prone to much higher flood risk than mountainous terrains. Isn't that obvious? Why? In subdued terrains, the entire watershed is contributing melt and runoff in synchronized ways. Unlike in mountainous terrains, where snow melts from different elevation bands in desynchronized fashion, therefore, right, mitigated the floods downstream. The aspect is a technical term, refers to the orientation of the mountain sides to the sun, right? The aspect distribution within a watershed plays a huge role in either synchronizing or desynchronizing melt and runoff. South and west exposed slopes deliver runoff to the outlet of a watershed at different times than north and east exposed slopes, obviously. The third factor of the landscape feature is above and below ground storage facilities in a watershed, such as soil act as a storage facility. Lakes, marshes, wetlands, floodplains play a huge role in slowing down runoff and hence mitigating floods downstream. You see how what dictates the flood is the landscape feature, including the forest. We'll come to that in a minute. The stream network in a watershed also plays a huge role in either synchronizing or desynchronizing runoff delivery to the outlet. You could see how it is the physical features of the landscape that impose the causal power of the relation between meteorology and floods. Meteorology, meaning in the form of snow, energy, and rain. Last but definitely not least, the forest cover and its role in affecting flood risk. It is critical that we pause for a moment to point out that the deterministic story that you hear all the time in the media and in the science literature till today about the role of forest in mitigate floods is the following, and that's a deterministic story, which is misleading. One, they tell you the removal of trees suppresses evapotranspiration, leaving behind wetter soil, therefore more runoff. Two, the removal of trees increases the energy available for melting the snow in a clear cut. Such a tree or stand level story about the role of forest on floods is incomplete and outright misleading, because the role of forest in mitigating the floods lies not at what happened at the tree or a stand, but at the watershed scale. And the larger the watershed, here is the trick. Here is the drama that have been missed as a result of the deterministic framework of investigating the relationship between forest and floods. If you use the proper approach, which is the probabilistic framework, the larger the watershed, the larger is the causal power of the forest in mitigating floods and droughts, which is diametrically opposite to an over a century, very well established wisdom, right? We often think of the landscape features features or characteristics as static features. Some people think that the stream network is actually a static feature. No, it's not. The stream network expands and shrinks depending on the state of wetness. So it itself, it becomes a random, the stream network has a role that becomes a random over time. Because the stream network is not static, it's a dynamic feature of the watershed, right? The role of lakes, the role of the topography, the role of aspect, as a result of the climate having that random nature to it over time, the role of all these physical features of the landscape become random over time. Then, of course, comes the role of disturbances of all kinds, which can further amplify the potential of floods. Forest cover changes by logging, beetle infestation, wildfire, urbanization, agricultural practice, mining, global warming, and climate change. In summary, drivers of floods are multiple, but also chancy. Hydroclimate drivers are necessary, but not sufficient to cause floods, which makes the flood response emergent, not fundamental. The landscape features play the biggest role in mitigating or amplifying floods. And of course, forestry is one of them. Moving on, see, the old forest hydrology that have guided us, which is a stand-level hydrology, assumes that the effect of forest on hydrology is a fundamental effect. No, it's an emergent effect. So we've been publishing in peer-reviewed journals, right? And the studies, take a look at that last publication number 11. Younes Alila 2024, actually. It was around Christmas. Science of Forest and Floods, the quantum leap forward needed, literally and metaphorically. Literally and metaphorically. The studies highlighted in blue applied the old deterministic and the new probabilistic to the same data sets to illustrate how the two frameworks do not lead to the same outcomes, especially on the effects on larger floods. As a matter of fact, the old underestimate the effects a great deal on hydrology and therefore geomorphology and everything else that associated with them. But also, the old framework led to the belief that the larger the event, the smaller is the effect of the forest disturbance. We reverse that 180 degrees. The larger the event, the larger is the effect. And before in the old, they think the forest disturbance over larger watershed would not have an effect, maybe over a small watershed, but not larger watersheds. They were not thinking of larger clear cuts the way we've been experiencing in here. But imagine yourself, those large clear cuts in a very subdued terrain, right? You're looking at a drama when it comes to how the risk of associated with it to hydrology, geomorphology, and everything else. Now, two publications in 2012 were actually recognized by the American Geophysical Union through a press release and as well through spotlight research paper. Conclusions. Okay, so please fasten your seatbelt. I'm going to take you on a roller coaster if you didn't feel it already yet. I'm going to give you nuggets of conclusions and findings and outcomes of 20 years of publications, 20 years of research work. Number one, clear-cut logging. Most often than not, affect not only small and medium events with a return period less than 10 years. A 10-year flood is that flood level in the river that is experienced on average once every 10 years. But it also affects the larger, more extreme floods, namely events with 20, 50, 100-year, and even the biblical floods. In most situations, an event size beyond which clear-cut logging do not have an effect on floods does not exist. And the larger the flood event, the greater the effect on such a flood event. Floods in larger watershed are affected by clear-cut logging more so than their smaller headwater tributaries. Depending on watershed physiographic characteristics, the physical characteristics of the watershed. Is it mountainous? Is it subdued in topography? What's the aspect distribution in it? How large the watershed is, etc. Depending on the physical characteristics of the watershed, extreme events such as the 50 and 100-year floods can become many times more frequent as a result of clear-cut logging. Many times, especially in subdued terrains, because you remove the trees, you increase the amount of snow and the amount of energy available to melt snow simultaneously from the better parts of the watershed. There is no aspect distribution that can, or elevation distribution within the watershed that can mitigate, that can desynchronize the melt. In subdued terrain, the melt is delivered to the channel network in a very synchronized manner, and therefore it amplifies the effect on the flood risk. Floods can be sensitive. Listen to this, right? Floods can be sensitive to even small clear-cut rates when occurring in critical mid to high elevation zones within mountainous high elevation range watersheds. This bullet is telling you all watersheds are super sensitive to clear-cut logging, irrespective of their physical characteristics, but for different reasons. Why? Because the drivers of floods are multiple, and urgency. With the flatter topographies are even more sensitive to clear-cut logging than areas on mountainous topographies due to synchronization of snow melt, regardless of cut block location or watershed size. There are two court cases for which I worked as an expert witness. And they both were winning outside the court, obviously, but they were winning nonetheless with settlements. The second one I was involved in is in Smithers. And the plaintiff lived in a property near the outlet of the watershed. The watershed is a 4 square kilometer watershed, flat, like crazy flat. There's only 50-meter elevation difference between the outlet and the ridges. Two-thirds of the watershed is covered with coniferous, 1/3 with deciduous. They logged 50% of the coniferous. Therefore, the ECA is 1/3. Immediately after they logged 1/3 of the forest, which is coniferous, every year became a big flood event. And this is why he went and sued. And the crux of the argument that made the day for the plaintiff in my 70-page report, expert witness report to the court, is that although the actual cut rate is 1/3 of the watershed, the effective cut rate is 2/3. Why? Because before the logging, the snow from the deciduous part of the watershed melted first. And then comes in later the snow from under the forest, coniferous, in desynchronized way. When they logged 1/3 of the watershed, which is coniferous, now suddenly the 1/3 coniferous and the 1/3 deciduous are melting simultaneously. The rest is history. Although the actual, you see, it's not just about the cut rate. It's not, and at times it's not the cut rate. It's what you leave behind. It's not how much you cut. It's what you leave behind, because you can cut in ways that synchronize the melt, which amplifies the floods. But you can only reveal this through the probabilistic. You can only appreciate how super sensitive the flood regime is to this kind of disturbance, clear cut, through the proper defensible framework. In some cases, a small clear cut within a watershed could wrongly lead to an expectation of less impact because of the sensitivity of floods is controlled, not only by how much is being logged, but by what is left behind after logging. You leave behind 1/3 deciduous. It's going to melt simultaneously with the cut block. And it's going to amplify dramatically as if you have logged 2/3 of the watershed. Logging practices other than clear cutting may still take advantage of the natural ability of the forest cover to mitigate against flood risk, especially so under changing climate. And this is for the what Michel calls secondary forest, isn't it? Secondary forest, right? The last. The effect of clear-cut logging is long-lasting, despite replanting, because the regrowth of the coniferous trees in snow environment is chronically slow. Full hydrologic recovery of the new forest to pre-disturbance conditions usually takes over 8 years. And when I say full hydrologic recovery, it's the hydrologic recovery that is relevant to professional practice, relevant to society, relevant to fish in the stream, relevant to the stability of the channels. It's the hydrologic recovery of runoff in the channel, not snow accumulation and melt rate at the stand, because that's what guided or misguided forestry in the province of British Columbia for decades and counting. This is my last slide, or the one before the last. When I figured that forest hydrologists have been misguided, I'm not talking about professionals, because professionals are just looking at the literature, and if the scientists are misguided, then automatically professionals are misguided. When I figured out that the forest hydrologists have been misguided by the wrong framework, I became curious. I wanted to know, go back into the 100 years of literature and find out, did anyone ever actually hinted to this thing? I am no forest hydrologist. I don't have the forest science background. I'm an engineer. And then I found this quote in 1982 by the godfather of forest hydrology from the US. God bless his soul. Look what he says. Hydrologists have understandably been confused by the difficulties inherent in describing the nature and frequency of floods to laymen. I'm not going to use as an excuse that the public does not understand the frequency and the dimension of frequency and the probability. No, I think the public does understand, but more so than the scientists. Why? Why? Because if you have a property that you think have been affected by logging upstream, by upstream logging, you will only feel you've got a strong case if you have now become flooded more frequently. If you experience only one event after the logging, you don't have a case. Even yourself, you don't think would have. But if you have not been flooded for the last 30 or 40 years, for how long as you've been living in this house, and suddenly now every other year is a big floods, frequency becomes the key thing that actually convinces you as a member of the public to go and sue. And you're telling me that the public does not understand the dimension of frequency? This dimension of frequency have evaded forest hydrology science community for a century and counting. Hydrologists have understandably been confused by the difficulties inherent in describing the nature and frequency of floods to laymen who are apt to have little patience with probability. Yeah, right. But among ourselves, he's speaking to his own science community. But among ourselves, we must drop back to rigorous language in order to discuss and trade information about land use causes and flood effects. The cause-effect relationship between forestry and hydrology can only be investigated through a probabilistic framework. And it has to be at the proper scale. And that's the only framework that make you realize that the effect of the forest on hydrology is an emergent and it's not a fundamental response. Fundamental response, that means it's dictated by what happened at a tree or at a stand or at a single hill slope, with not accounting for the cumulative effect. And this is my last. Future forest practices must be guided by the probabilistic framework, referred to outside forest hydrology by the science of extremes. Landslides, droughts, right? Landslides, droughts, floods are extremes, like weather extremes. And if climatologists and climate change science have been using that for decades and publishing with it, we have no excuse in forest hydrology, not the science community, nor the professionals who are making decisions for the government and the industry. They can only claim scientific rigor and scientific defensibility if they use this probabilistic framework, and it is the only framework that reveal how super sensitive the hydrology is in our lovely mountainous environment, dominated by the snow in particular, because it's the mountains, it's the snow, and the slow melt of the snow, and the fact that it's draped with forest that makes it mitigative by nature. The hydrology is mitigated by nature, which means the geomorphology is mitigated by nature, which means that the water quality is mitigated by nature, which means communities downstreams are protected by nature. This is why I am for nature-based solutions. However, ask yourself the question, do you understand nature for you to be able to call for nature-based solution? If we do not understand nature in that probabilistic framework, good luck being able to manage the risk of flooding, the risk of droughts, and the risk of landslides. Thank you very much.